Okay, we're back for episode 87 of Powers and Principalities. Joe, how you doing?
Just fine, Tim. Good to hear your voice.
Okay, good to hear from you too. So tonight we agreed to talk about income tax, particularly the federal income tax, what it's all about. And of course, income tax in the United States, I pulled this from various sources, Wikipedia, the Tax Foundation, so it's sort of an amalgamation. But income taxes in the United States are imposed by federal, most state, and many local governments. The income taxes are determined by applying a tax rate, which may increase as income increases, to taxable income, which is the total income less allowable deductions. Income is broadly defined. Individuals and corporations are directly taxable, and estates and trusts may be taxable on undistributed income. In the United States, the term payroll tax usually refers to FICA taxes that are paid to fund Social Security, Medicare, while income tax refers to taxes that are paid into state and federal general funds. Taxpayers generally must self-assess income tax by filing tax returns. Advance payments of tax are required in the form of withholding tax or estimated tax payments. The tax rate of the federal level is graduated, which of course means that higher tax rates for higher incomes. The federal income tax bracket currently has 7 brackets with rates of 10%, 12%, 22%, 24%, 32%, 35%, and 37%. According to the Pew Research Center, IRS data from 2015, the most recent available shows that taxpayers with incomes of $200,000 or more paid well over half the federal income tax. It's 58.8%, almost 59%, though they accounted for less than 4.5% of all returns, filing 6.8% of all taxable returns. By contrast, taxpayers with incomes below $30,000 filed nearly 40% of all returns, but paid just 1.4% of all federal income tax. In fact, two-thirds of the nearly 66 million returns filed by people in the lowest income tier owed no tax at all. Effective tax rates are calculated as income taxes owed divided by adjusted gross income, also rise with income. On average, taxpayers making less than $30,000 paid an effective rate of 4.9% in 2015. Compared to 9.2% for those making between $50,000 and under $100,000, and 27.5% for those incomes of $2 million or more. The history of federal taxation, the history of income taxes in the United States, from the Tax Foundation. The nation had few income taxes in its early years. The nation had few taxes in its early years. From 1791 and 1802, the United States government was supported by internal taxes on distilled spirits, carriages, refined sugar, tobacco, and snuff. Property sold at auction, corporate bonds, and slaves. The high cost of the War of 1812 brought about the nation's first sales tax on gold, silverware, jewelry, and watches. In 1817, however, Congress did away with all internal taxes, relying on tariffs on imported goods to provide sufficient funds for running the government. In its first 100 years, the United States supported its federal government with a series of what we called sin taxes, today on whiskey, tobacco, and sugar. By 1817, all internal taxes were abolished by Congress. In 1862, in order to support the Civil War effort, Congress enacted the nation's first income tax law. It was a forerunner of our modern income tax in that it was based on the principle of graduated or progressive taxation and of withholding income at the source. Additional sales and excise taxes were added as an inheritance tax also made its debut. In 1866, internal revenue collection reached their highest point in the nation's 90-year history, more than $310 million, an amount not reached again until 1911. In 1868, Congress again focused its taxation efforts on tobacco and distilled spirits and eliminated the income tax in 1872, had a short-lived revival in 1894 and 1895. In the latter year, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the income tax was unconstitutional because it was not apportioned among the states in conformity with the Constitution. I believe that was the Pollock decision. In 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution made income tax a permanent fixture in the U.S. tax system. The amendment gave Congress the legal authority to tax income and resulted in a revenue law that taxed incomes of both. So the amendment gave the legal authority to tax incomes and resulted in revenue law. The amendment read, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. In fiscal year 1918, annual internal revenue collections for the first time passed the $1 billion mark, rising to $5.4 billion by 1920. With the advent of World War II, employment increased, as did tax collection, to $7.3 billion. The withholding tax on wages was introduced in 1943, as was instrumental in increasing the number of taxpayers to 60 million, and tax collection to $43 billion by 1945. It's true. Until the Second World, most Americans did not pay federal income tax. 1981, Congress enacted the largest tax cut in U.S. history, approximately $750 billion over 6 years. The tax reduction, however, was partially offset by two tax acts in 1982 and 1984 that attempted to raise approximately $265 billion. In October 1986, Reagan signed into law the Tax Reform Act of 1986, one of the most far-reaching reforms in the United States tax system since the adoption of the income tax. The top tax rate on individual income was lowered from 50% to 28%, the lowest it had been since 1916. That's before the American entry into the First World War. Tax preferences were eliminated to make up most of the revenue. In an attempt to remain revenue neutral, the act called for a $120 billion increase in business taxation and a corresponding decrease in individual taxation over a 5-year period. Following what seemed to be a yearly tradition of new tax acts that began in 1986, the Revenue Reconciliation Act of 1990 was signed into law on November 5, 1990. As with the 1987, 1988, and 89 Acts, the 1990 Act, while providing a number of substantive provisions, was small in comparison to the 1986 Act. The emphasis of the 1990 Act was increase of taxes on the wealthy. In August 1993, President Clinton signed a Revenue Reconciliation Act of 1993 into law. The act's purpose was to reduce approximately $496 billion federal deficit that would otherwise accumulate in the fiscal years through 1994 and 1998. In 1997, Clinton signed the Tax Act. The act, which cut taxes by $152 billion, included a cut in capital gains for individuals and a $500 per child tax credit and tax incentives for education. More recently, George W. Bush signed a series of tax cuts into law. The largest was the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001. It was estimated to save taxpayers $1.3 trillion over 10 years, making the third largest tax cut since World War II. The Bush tax cut created a new lowest rate of 10% for $7,000 earners. Now, it's interesting that all this time they're cutting taxes, they're also increasing spending and borrowing. So many of these tax cuts are sort of it's in many ways an accounting gimmick, I guess you could say. But that's sort of a brief history of income tax and how it's changed over the years. And now we've become used to constant debates over tax reform: who pays more, who should pay less. That's what the debate tends to focus on. We're worried about income tax, but the federal spending, bottom line, federal spending continues to grow, and so does the debt. So, Joe, what do you have to say?
Well, don't pay your taxes.
Comply, please. I don't.
Oh well, I mean, you get to go to prison.
Yeah,
but so you have to pay your taxes, I guess. But I think that taxation is sort of an important concept for the citizen to kind of have more understanding of than they currently do, in my opinion. And I think like kind of the first place that I would, whenever I get asked about taxation, and I have been asked many times to give opinions about this, I will say, I don't know why, but I have. I always go to the Boston Tea Party, which was, it was basically an anti-taxation protest. And the reason that I think that this is a good place to start is that, in my opinion, it of course was part of or central to the process of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And I think it's basically fake. In other words, we've talked about, at least my opinion, of how the wars are generally just fake narrations for the population, for the purpose of population reduction through war. So the people need to have some story given to them so they can accept or root for one side or the other. And so with the Revolutionary War, you had the Boston Tea Party, which was a Masonic project. There's simply no other way it can be looked at, right? I mean, a group of Masons met over a series of months. They were meeting in the Green Dragon Tavern, which was directly below the Masonic Lodge, the largest lodge in Boston. And the first thing is that no one actually knows who made the decision. This is something that is lost to history. In other words, you have even songs about it and pictures that were drawn at the time. One famous one by a guy named Johnson of the lodge and the Green Dragon Inn, and it has like above the building, the artist has created the compass and square with the big G right in the middle, and this is like the first. This painting is, my opinion, it's the first iconic representation of the American Revolution. And oddly enough, even though we know the names of some of the guys, Revere and Franklin, and stuff, no one really knows who is actually pulling the strings. And I have a suspicion about why this is the case, because this was all being focused against the East Asia Trading Company that was bringing the tea in, and they had a little song that they sang, and it talked about how onerous this company was, and I won't sing the song, but the fact is that people disliked it for a number of reasons, and they talked about the detestable tea shipped for this port by the East India Company. That was on the handbill that Joseph Warren and Paul Revere were circulating. So they were playing up the hatred for the East India Company, and this is a group of Masons, right? Well, okay. First point is that there's something that stinks here, because the East India Company is the most Masonic project in world history. I mean, it was the arm of British Freemasonry that went out into the world and set up the international lodge system. Okay, 100%. I mean, it's the company that forced opium in, and then had the Masonic groups basically organize themselves militarily and also politically. And like Palmerston, who helped ram the company back into China after the Chinese had kicked it out. So you see, there's something really wrong here, because since both sides of the dispute are Masons, you see, this is reminding me of World War I and World War II and the Civil War. You see, so this is not something I like, because then you have to remember that George Washington battling the troops of George III or whatever the British monarch. These guys are also Masons. So my long-winded point is just that taxation is kind of psychological control in a way, because it creates a hated focus, right? So it enables people to be manipulated. And I think that to really understand America, you have to understand that this no taxation without representation, this emotional adage that has been, used time and time again to organize people, is really just a distraction. And in fact, I would say, that like the Tea Party, this latest political manifestation, is really a good example of this. Where we'll talk later on about legerdemain. We talked about fake accounting. Legerdemain is a word that applies to basically just creating the profiles of profit and loss that you want to create with clever accounting tricks for the purpose of fooling people. It's financial sophistry, right? Legerdemain. And so this whole no taxation without representation, in my mind, is an example of this, in that they could have worked this out. The Masons could, if they wanted to avoid the war, they could have worked this out easily. So this is the first thing I was going to say, is that when you get to taxation and its emotional kind of psychological relationship to this country, this way so many people have this connection to it, they should really, they seldom stand back, I think, and just ask the question of, well, to what extent is it just oligarchic manipulation? I mean, a lot of people can see oligarchic manipulation and things like the counterculture, et cetera, but it's also there in the tax code. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that I think the whole tax code is basically illegal. The 16th Amendment has never really been ratified. I don't know if you ever looked at any of this, Tim, but it's absolutely hilarious if you get in there. There's a guy named Benson, I think his name is, but many people have done this. They've gone in and looked at the ratification of the 16th Amendment, and they say there's just no way it's real. In fact, this one guy who's actually, I forget his name, but he's a really good historian, he says that he thinks that only 2 states actually legally ratified. And so what happened is I think his name was Philander Knox. Yeah, that's the guy. He was the Secretary of State. And basically, he just said in 1913, after the bill had been put to the House and the Senate, that it had been ratified. There was never any accounting done. There was never any, precise, like, well, who voted for it? Which are the individuals? Can we see the documents? Never got done. It was just this kind of ramrod through. It's sort of like the Federal Reserve System, basically. And if you look at Philander Knox, I mean, he's a huge Freemason. He was followed by William Jennings Bryan, another Mason. I think they were actually in the same lodge. And Bryant, who should have questioned what Knox had done with the amendment, or demanded that there, some certification and documents be produced, he never did. He just said, yeah, it's in place. And so then you had no longer any restrictions upon basically the political class from creating money, because once the lid was off on taxation, and they were stymied by the article in the Constitution. What is it, like? I forget the name of it, but there's an article in the Constitution which basically is very clear as far as you can't really tax. There has to be these very peculiar circumstances. Yeah, Article 1, Section 2. And also that you had to have, like representation and direct taxes, where the states would basically be the ones making these decisions, which of course would be like how the Constitution had been set up. Well, this all got swept away with the 16th Amendment. And of course, in my opinion, the reason why it was done in 1913 is pretty clear, isn't it? They wanted to create revenue for munitions, because World War I was going to be coming up. And so they wanted to, create a larger army. That's always been certainly the primary goal of the, taxation. And so this is what, we have today. We have this warfare state, which is supported by taxation to the extent that they can tax. But it's also supported by legerdemain, which comes from the capacity to tax. The capacity to tax gave Congress basically unlimited checking account, because now that it had basically a secure source of income, it could leverage the income up into infinity, right? It can pay back the debt, the idea being. And so the 16th Amendment is really, a very, very important thing for people to be aware of and understand, is that it was never really ratified. I mean, I've looked at this pretty closely, and there's no chance it was ever legally ratified. And it was done with the idea of just giving basically the creation of technological weapons to the oligarchs that ran Congress.
Also, the passage, or the passage of the 16th Amendment also coincides with the passage of the 17th Amendment, which did with direct election of senators, whereas prior to that, senators were appointed by the state legislatures. So again, it was a centralizing of power.
Yep.
Often this was referred to as a revolution of 1913, because also the same year that the Federal Reserve was created, and the creation of the nation's central bank was key to this legerdemain you're referring to, because increasingly in the 20th century, the Fed would be granted the power to monetize debt, which is a big thing, because they can literally create money out of thin air and purchase government bonds with it, and play all types of games with the economy, and create booms and bust, and enrich allies or friends or these things, and impoverish others, and so it's all part of that package that we saw in 1913.
Taxation was central to it.
Yeah.
The thing with taxation, the real purpose for taxation is just to create the capacity for income on the part of the government. This is all. I mean, obviously, that's just sort of like almost self-evident. But the point is not that the government needed the income, really. It's that now the government has the capacity for something that can be leveraged, for leveraging. And you see, that's why the Federal Reserve is created at the same time. They should have, to be fair, they are honest, they should have just created them as one total package, but they separated them so people would have a harder time understanding. But they work hand in hand.
However, income tax was supposedly a progressive measure. It was a tax to rich, soak the rich campaign. William Jennings Bryan, Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster.
Yeah, the old trust buster. Let's break up Standard Oil into like 10 monopolies, all owned by the Rockefeller family. Yeah, I mean, he's just a piece of work. And so anyway, yeah, so it's all just, I call it like financial sophistry. If you look at the tax stuff, what they were actually after, the guys who were pushing it, it's the same group that were creating the Federal Reserve on the other side. Obviously, I mean, they're running through, and so you have this idea that the government will have a credit card, and it's an eternal credit card once this happens. And they knew this. They knew this when they created it, because the criticism of why the Federal Reserve, and even there was even some criticism by some far-seeing visionaries at the time, that you really don't want to create this structure of income to the government. You always want it to be, as it has been in the past, the sort of special needs, where there has to be a legitimate special need. You talked about the Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, this is not, in my opinion, not a legitimate need, but at least there has to be some, purported emergency or crisis. Otherwise, the government would be in violation of the Constitution with the taxation thing. So they, when they created the eternal income stream, they did it at the same time with the Federal Reserve, so that the real purpose of the Federal Reserve is just to have, they say, well, it's to, they had this, like, the financial crisis where they needed to be a
lender of last resort.
Last resort, right? Yeah. So they can insert liquidity. But the idea of the lender of last resort means the lender of unlimited.
Yeah. And then, lo and behold, a war comes, and they have to.
Just shocking, isn't it? Yeah. How it all works out. So then, and we're all set to go. The government can just crank up the debt as rapid and as it needs to. And what does it do with it? The first thing it does with the legerdemain, with the taxation, is basically start creating weapons and this army. So you get to see the future, right? Immediately,
What's interesting is of course, this wasn't a smooth process. There's some bumps in the road for the oligarchs. I mentioned the 1895, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. And there was, I think it was Justice Stephen J. Field, in a 5-4 ruling, stated as there is no such thing in the theory of our national government as a limited power of taxation in Congress. There are limitations, as he justly observes, of its powers arising out of the essential nature of the free governments. There are reservations of individual rights without which society could not exist, in which were respected by every government. The right of taxation is subject to these limitations, so the power to tax, like other powers granted in the Constitution, wasn't presumed to be unlimited. And of course, when they passed the federal income tax, I think there's one member of the House of Representatives said, the imposition of the income tax will corrupt the people. It will bring in its train the spy and the informer. It will necessitate a swarm of officials with inquisitorial powers. It will be a step towards centralization. It breaks another canon of the taxation. It breaks another canon of taxation that it's expensive and in its collection and cannot be fairly imposed. And finally, it is contrary to the traditions and principles of Republican government. So there was some awareness at the time, but yeah, I think you're right. It was almost like a steamroller. It was inevitable because the powers that be wanted it, and they declared it such. We talk about the American War of Independence, and one of the rallying cries was no taxation without representation, and the issue was taxes. There's the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and these things that supposedly motivated Americans to declare their independence. But if you look at the tax burden under British rule, there was nothing compared to what it is today, and immediately the tax burden was much higher after America had won its independence. So immediately the taxes became much more burdensome. And, you might ask, someone might say, so how has taxation with representation worked out for you? You look at the IRS and some of its tactics, and it is largely unfortunately, it is a lawless agency because it acts arbitrarily and administratively, and just practically speaking, people have little recourse when they are set in its sights. Anyone who's been audited or something, and sometimes it's just guesswork on the part of IRS agents who know that they can target you and audit you and make you settle with them, and it's pretty vicious.
I can speak about personal experience. I've been audited many times, and my favorite audit. I'm not sure I should actually get into this. But I won't even mention the entity. But at the end of the day, the guy and I just stood across it. We had a desk between us, and he said, "You're going to pay this amount." And I go, "Why? I've shown you every single thing. There's no chance. I mean, I'm just going to fight it." And he goes, "No, you're going to pay it." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because this is how much it'll cost to fight it."
Yeah.
I mean, actually, this is what he said to me. He said, "This is what it'll cost you." And this particular tax entity, you only have one court to go into, right?
Yeah.
So they have all the expenses wired. They just and so my response was, I said, "Okay, well, I guess you got me. You're like nothing I can do. I'm going to have to give you that much money. But can you do me a favor next time?" And he says, "What?" And I said, "Look, if you're going to strong arm me, why don't you just give me the bill at the beginning?
Yeah.
We can why do we have to go through the whole process? I mean, I'm sitting here with like a whole room full of books and documents and invoices and stuff. I just feel like a complete idiot. I've spent thousands of dollars of accounting money and stuff. All you had to do was just come in here and say, we're the muscle and you got to pay us."
Yeah.
That would have been fine. Just save the money. But anyway, that's on a petite bourgeois level. I mean, this is my circumstance. It's nothing. But it's just an example, in my opinion, of just how corrupt the whole thing is. And it's completely corrupt because it's completely legerdemain. There's you look at the history of taxation and you can see it's always been under the control of the oligarchs or used for purposes that the public doesn't understand. And it goes to some of the stuff we've talked about over and over again about how the normie, to use an expression, has the basic problem of just being in a kind of a hypnotized state. And so, they like I have family members and their whole goal in the world is to vote for politicians that they think will lower taxation. Like that in and of itself is some kind of, panacea for all the ills in the world. And they don't understand that, look, if they want to tax in the sense of taking, wealth away from the public, there's a million ways they can do it without just stealing it out of your checking account. They can just debase the currency.
And they do for about a third of the budget.
What's going on now, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And so people say, "Oh, I've got to get Reagan. He's so terrific," or look at the tax bill that George W. Well, but look at the Federal Reserve activity during this time. Look at the federal debt during this time. Look at how the currency is losing value, and they don't see that, right? And then of course on the other side, but well, what is this debase? How is the currency being debased? It's because the oligarchs are spending, 10 times more than is actually coming in revenue, right? They have access to all the credit. They have access to the banks. The government is basically in back of all of them.
Yeah, they're using the federal credit to enrich themselves.
Yeah, so you're getting debased, and at the same time you're sitting there going, God, isn't this great? Reagan lowered taxes,
Yeah, but then if you look at it, the taxes he imposed, he got the tax cuts passed, but then federal spending doubled during his presidency.
Well, sure, and also
debt exploded.
Well, yeah, and so but gosh darn, we had to fight the commies, So, but the thing is that this is the real problem is just that the population is.
Well, here's an example of a real tax cut that America actually got without even lowering rates. It's kind of funny because although rates stayed nominally high, you had all these deductions, so no one's really paying these rates. It's legerdemain. But an example of a tax cut would have been 1921, demobilization of World War II, massive cuts in federal spending, like 3/4. 1946, demobilization from World War II, the federal budget was cut by more than 2/3, and you had a boom. You had the post-war boom. Same thing, you had the boom in the 20s. So, you had a lot of dislocation because of war mobilization. These things, the war and the war spending really dislocates or distorts the economy in many ways. In many ways, it's even hard to track. But nevertheless, that's an example of a tax cut. Even though rates remained high, federal spending plummeted. That's a real tax cut. Whereas, although Reagan cut rates from 70% down to 28% over 6 years, federal spending steadily increased throughout his presidency and has continued to grow since then. There's never been a reduction in federal spending, which would be a real tax cut for the public, because that represents resources being used by the government. Yeah,
100%. Oh man, that's so true. It's like I have a family member, relative. He and his wife make over deep six figures, right? And they live in San Francisco. He's an attorney. She's a professional person. They can't even afford to buy a house. They're almost 40. They're trying to save money so they can have a kid, right?
Making $600,000 a year.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not exaggerating. This is 100% correct. This is the circumstance they find themselves in. And they think, well, it's because of the taxation, right? The state is taking all this money. Otherwise, this is true, but really a net income of $350,000 a year should be able to keep the wife at home and the baby with some food in its mouth.
You'd think, yes.
Yeah. If it doesn't, right, if you have to live in San Francisco in order to get these wages, and then, homes cost $3 million and restaurants cost $400, if you have to live like that, then you have to actually then ask yourself, well, wait a second, how did it get to where the dollar only buys, you need $4 million to buy a 1,800 square foot condo with a leaky roof, And so this is the thing. Taxation is a pretty good place to start, the training of the mind of the normie, in my opinion, because everyone hates it. And they're intuitively paranoid about it, which is great, right? Because they're worried that there's some evil in back of it. The people on the left think that that there's the wealthy people are not paying enough, and then people on the right are thinking, well, the government is really using it for evil purposes. And in fact, they're both right. You see.
Yeah.
So this is a good place to start because you have some emotional momentum, where you can kind of start to turn them to the larger picture of, well, there's another way to tax, and taxation, which is basically just wealth transfer, right? That's really what we're talking about. It's wealth transfer. There's many ways that the oligarchs, the people who control the country, can do this. Can they affect this? If you just look at the social circumstance, right, where you have, women and have to be in the workplace just to afford a home, right, with their husband, well, then who's going to have the baby, right? Where's the family? You see, when we were talking before the show, we were talking about, or in the exchange we had, the email exchange, we were talking about how taxation is psyops and social control.
Yeah.
And as taxation as a part of the whole ledger main process, whereby basically the people are being made poor, is a critical component. But it isn't as powerful in my mind as the financial debasement, which I think is a larger force. And
no, it's a stealth tax.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's a stealth tax, and it's also the debasement is caused by the invention of credit, right, for the federal government, for the state, Mm-hmm. Well, that's where the debasement occurs, and this is where the mischief is, because that now you have the government able to have all these black box projects. I mean, at the UC near us, I mean, they have I'm not exaggerating, they have billions of dollars every year spent. This is a little, well, you see, it's a UC school, which is supposed to be for educating the students. But so it has billions of dollars being spent on, little tiny nano robots that are going to go and spy on people. I mean, it's just insane how much DARPA and all these alphabet soups. I mean, the CIA is it has a hard time even getting people to come to the booth, because there's so many government soup agencies at these work fairs that they're all hiring people. It's just a cesspool of government, development of technology, using the university, using these students and the expertise to develop a technologic slave state, And where does the money come from? Well, they just have it, It just comes where they need it, And so they keep the taxation wherever they want to. They all they have the UI tax and all the payroll taxes, right? So those are fairly large fractions of the total money that comes into the government, and they're very regressive. In other words, basically they keep middle class or lower middle class people poor, right? So they get you on both sides of it.
It's 15%.
Yeah, absolutely, just really destructive. And so they get you on all sides. You've got the payroll taxes, right? Then you've got the compound interest, which is just this fantasy ledger main structure, where they just you can never pay off the debt.
That's another oligarch tax, yeah,
and it's.
But no one looks at usury. They're worried about marginal tax rates.
Yeah, that's right. It's we got to lower the tax rate, but don't worry about compound interest on money that didn't exist and they just invented to give to you.
Well, here's the point. When they talk about soaking the rich and taxing the rich, and I'm not a fan of that rhetoric or that approach anyway. I think people should be able to keep the lion's share of what they earn and in these things, and I don't think you should penalize success. But that said, when the rich who get soaked aren't the rich we're talking about. We're not talking about the multi-million-dollar athlete who makes $10 million a year and then gets hit on 300, pays a huge $3-4 million a year in taxes. The rock star who finds that his agent funneled all the money away somewhere in Cayman Islands. Now he's stuck with the tax bill. That happens to a lot of rock stars. This is why George Harrison wrote the song "Tax Man," the Beatles, and facing some of the enormously high tax rates of 1960s Britain and these things, whereas 110% on some levels. So they worked it out. But when we're talking about the rich, we're not talking about the Beatles. We're not talking about a star quarterback or an athlete or even a professional couple making $800,000 a year. They're well-to-do by any standard, but they're not rich. The rich don't pay any taxes. And we're talking about the oligarchs, because one thing is they control the banking system, they control the money supply, and if they do pay any taxes, it's an accounting gimmick. In fact, it's come out in the past. I think it was in 2004. Teresa Hines, who was the wife of John Kerry, the Democratic candidate, came out and said she's ashamed because she didn't pay an income tax. Well, she technically didn't have any income because she has foundations and all these other things. And that's the same thing with Warren Buffett. His executive secretary paid more tax than he did a year. And he came out for more taxes, higher tax rates, as if he's going to pay.
Well, I gave the example where like the local school, because it had a successful lemonade stand, actually had to pay a California tax on it, and it paid more tax than Apple.
Yeah,
which has over like 40,000 employees, but somehow, even though it has like $120 billion in offshore, and
it's technically not profitable.
Well, see, this is the thing. Again, it goes to ledger main. It just
like
goes,
Amazon, right?
Yeah, it's my favorite ledger main was Mitt Romney and Bain Capital. This was just hilarious. So Bain Capital, they were a vulture kind of VC fund. They would come in, they would buy a little company, and then they would. There's actually a real example, and I think it was like a washing machine company, and it had like $2 or $3 million in debt, and it was making $3 to $4 million a year. So the Bain Capital came in, they bought the company. They immediately shipped all the jobs overseas, and they were able to create a P&L with because they got the employment down so low, with maybe a 25% increase in profitability. Right, the revenue was the same, but the profitability was gone up. And so with that, they could say, "Look, we're geniuses. We own the we really know what we're doing here, making washing machines. So we need to go to the debt market." And they went to Goldman Sachs and they floated bonds, well, most of them which got sold to public employee pensions and stuff. And of course, Goldman was an easy place to go for Mitt, because his dad had been a director of Goldman Sachs, back when, before he was like whatever. But so Mitt then, so what happens is now they get the debt, then the company has all this money, and where it happens to the money? Well, the money goes to consulting companies. Now, these consulting companies are offshore, right? The company then never has profit. It only has debt. You see what I mean? The company has the debt of the bond. The money from the bond goes overseas to the consulting company. Mitt Romney had 37 offshore accounts. Right, and you can't audit them; they're all in the these little weird countries. But I guarantee every single one of them was filled with the debt that had been created. But the point is that these guys can take millions of dollars in debt. Right, the company has no income tax; it never pays any, and the individuals, the offshore consulting companies, they're not even on the tax rolls. Right. These are like foreign companies, that just don't even, that have nothing to do with our income situation. So this is like what you're dealing with. What Romney was doing was technically legal, right? I mean, he was an attorney. All of the people there, I think, in Bain were attorneys. They knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't violating the laws, but they were just, first of all, they were destroying small companies because they always end up bankrupt. And then secondly, they don't pay any income tax. There's no income. It's all debt, you see, because it's all ledger main. And this is the thing, is that when you have malevolent secret society and control of stuff, man, tax reform, in my opinion, is a complete, it's a distraction.
Yeah, it's what you described is almost if you want to know how that works, is just to go see the movie Goodfellas, is when they destroy that man's restaurant. The gangsters just access to credit. They kind of muscle the way into being a partnership, and then they, on the store credit, buy all types of liquor and food, then steal it out the back, and then there's the empty husk of the business that has to go under, and they make off with it. They got rich off the store's credit.
Exactly. This is the thing, is that the suckers, to use an expression, like my poor family member in San Francisco, they just can never get ahead, really.
Yeah, but it's okay, because New York elected that representative, Ocasio-Cortez or whatever, Alexandra.
Yeah. I mean,
she's out there dancing and calling for tax, soaking the rich. So they're going to get theirs.
Really, and then I don't know if you saw this, but last week at a synagogue, she announced that I guess it's probably a good thing for me to mention this, but I'm actually from a Sephardic Jewish family.
Oh, now she tells them.
Yeah. So, but it's okay because in Puerto Rico we're very multicultural. And of course, it's a synagogue. But you see, the point is, I wish I could recall. I'm pretty sure she even mentioned DNA doesn't really mean anything. And see, what I think, it's sort of like Madonna with the DNA cleanup crew. I think there's a lot of people now that are saying, when these guys come out and they have this meteoric rise, right? Gloria Steinem, this kind of stuff. People want to know now about their background. I think that's a really, really good sign. And so that's why when she comes out and she goes, well, I'm Jewish,
And she just happens to have this music video from college.
Yeah. So the thing is so she's like the latest cul-de-sac leader. She'll take you into like, we've got to have a more progressive income tax. Yeah, this is really going to help with the Federal Reserve creating, trillions and trillions of dollars.
Well, there's the Pentagon, the black hole at the Pentagon.
This is these insane black holes. It's like, look, the whole point is, I'm telling you, Tim, there just isn't any real value in the dollar. The dollar is legerdemain. What is legerdemain is our belief that the thing has some value. It can never have any real value because the people don't have any control over it whatsoever. Mm-hmm. We cannot create credit. We cannot, so since we can't determine what credit will be, who will get charged what rate, right? It's like, well, my new job is paying me $1 trillion a year. I think I've deserved my raise. And the problem is the federal deficit has just gone up $1 gazillion trillion, and I can't even buy a hamburger with my, so it's just, there's no, with the source of credit not in the hands of the public and not being exposed to democratic visibility, right? We can look at who's getting it, who's paying what. They've got all these black boxes like the discount window and stuff. No one can audit any of that. You can't see any of this stuff. There's nothing there. We should we really.
Yeah, who knows what the Federal Reserve's funding with its monetization?
For how much?
Yeah, the New York Fed can fund black operations, can pay for hit teams.
Well, the thing, I think the cat got out of the bag when Bernanke said he announced, we came up with a $16 trillion swap for the European banks during the credit crisis because otherwise they might have all failed. So, the euro wasn't working, and so we gave him $16 trillion of U.S. credit. Now, the guy said, well, where did you get the authorization for it? Bernanke just laughed. We don't need any authorization.
The congressman, you think you have oversight?
Right. So that's the point, is that if they can actually whip up $16 trillion, that was the number, $16 trillion. The idea of like, well, we've got to get a tax reduction here. Guys, this is just a complete distraction. The reason why we're so poor is because we don't have any control at all over the creation of credit and money. This is why we're poor. If we were just left to our own devices, I'm telling you, we would have been, paradise on earth would have been long ago. But they control wealth because they control the creation of credit. And so that's the battle we should be fighting. We shouldn't, we want to stop the wars. We want to stop the oligarchic technological enslavement of us. We have to stop the tool they're using, right, to pay for everything.
Well, because with the control of credit and therefore the control of money, you can buy everyone off. And and what I mean by buying people off is they can reward people and punish people accordingly, and that's how it works. And you can create large-scale social engineering with that, because you see this done, and maybe we'll talk about this in later talk about sort of using the corporations to carry out social alchemy and cultural revolution. We see that now, with various ad themes or ad campaigns and human resource and policies of corporations. Now, they're the ones that are pushing the cultural Marxism stuff after the long march through the institutions was successful. Now the corporations are sort of, boldly prosecuting the revolution. Yeah.
But I mean, the corporations are just part of they're just like a free enterprise ledger main. They're
Yeah.
just thought control. I mean, where does Amazon come from? I mean, it just comes from the government, basically. And what is the government? Not the government we elect. It's the real government, the secret society.
I asked Alexa where Amazon came from. She didn't answer me. So
Yeah. So
I wonder if you ask her, is Jeff Bezos the devil? See what she'll say to you. So.
Well, actually, he is. I mean, or at least he's certainly satanic. These guys are all satanic. Gates, the course. But they have the appearance of corporation, but they're just the way the technologic slave state is being onset. Amazon will be responsible for all delivery of food and all delivery of, information. We talked last week about how they're already creating their own literature, their own fictional and non-fictional narrative. They have what's described as an army of writers.
Yeah, and if you misbehave, you'll be denied your Amazon Prime access.
Exactly. I try to sell my books on Amazon, and I can tell you it's getting, they are very, it's a very difficult situation. And I think it doesn't look good for the independent author in the future. Amazon is going to compete against you, and it's sort of like, when you have this combination of Amazon and Google, you really have the devil and Satan working hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because Google will control, where someone who's interested in your subject matter is taken to, and then Amazon will create the competitor to whatever book you might have been trying to get, and that person will have the right government spin. And so then the question is, well, where does Google and Amazon come from? It comes from the ledger main. It comes from the ledger main that all gets started in 1913. Well, at least to the extent that the income tax created the credit card, and so the citizen should be, suspicious of the motivations of taxations, but needs to understand that the tax is part of a larger process of mind control. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, also just the simple act of the requirement of compliance. They go through the process. That's all part of social engineering. People comply with this. People accept its inevitability. We've made the point that really with the Federal Reserve, why government, if government did, government could get money from the Federal Reserve just to monetize whatever bonds they need to fund the general government, or the government could print its own money. But yet it creates this system, where it has to borrow at interest, money created out of thin air, and at the same time to tax the people to pay for the interest on the national debt. I think pretty much what the government collects annually from federal income tax usually covers what is owed on interest on the ever expanding national debt.
Yeah, it's about the same, and it's certainly it's just a part of social control, that it's like a gigantic, compound interest, that the interest on the federal debt will never be able to be paid off. It'll always be expanding. And so it doesn't matter what your income is, you're going to be nibbled away, and you'll never be able to have a house and your wife living there with children.
Yeah.
Because these forces are impossible to overcome. And so instead of...
God forbid you lose your deductions. A good example is, tax for exempt status of churches. That if they get political, they can lose their tax exempt status. And it's one way to muzzle the churches, to keep them, in line. Because no one wants to lose their deduction.
The Freemasons, they don't pay any tax. They're a 501(c)(3).
Well, they're a charitable operation, Joe.
Yeah, they are a charitable operation.
So is the Rockefeller Foundation. And another thing is also, just when income tax is being created, the federal income tax is being created in the United States, you have the oligarchs creating the tax-free foundations, which have such a profound impact on American culture and history.
Yeah, the tax-free foundations basically were the battering ram of cultural Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the fact that they could move the like these enormous estates, which were all basically stolen money, into these foundations without the public ever getting an access to any of the capital was just created this impossible to resist financial power, right? The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rothschild Getty Trust. I mean, these things are all funding cultural Marxism basically 24/7, and they don't pay any taxes. So there is the lumpen proletariat who is working as a computer technician, making 80,000 a year. His whole culture and physical nature is being transformed, and he doesn't have any weapons to fight with. I mean, his this capacity to organize and the finances to able to do it just don't exist. I mean, think about even the truther movement, 911. I mean, there's no money in it.
No.
If there was like $10 million, they could take like ads out and they'd start a bonfire. There just isn't any money in it, right? Why not? It's because the way the system works, if you're a real human being, not in the tribe of the secret society, man, you cannot get ahead.
Well, no, because $100 million will be spent on a 911 museum that pushes the official narrative.
Yeah.
Or whatever museum you happen to run into, right? Or whether it's the Holocaust Museum or the
Holocaust
Museum, or
Museum,
the Smithsonian Institute, right? Anything's place.
Yeah.
Ever, have you ever been to like a museum of history of modern history, and you find yourself just going, "What? Well, that's not true." Well, I take an issue with that.
Yeah, I mean they're just propaganda devices.
Yeah, yeah.
And
that's
so
the same thing with Hollywood, right? I mean, it's movies and these things that they get all the funding. They're endowed with multi-billion-dollar corporations, $100 million movies, structures. They create the curriculum in schools, They endow chairs at universities, and they're able to dole out rewards for people who toe the line, and people who don't have no status. When you have no status, you don't get it. You don't get money. You don't get women.
Yeah. So this is the thing, is that the taxing, it's like when I started my little rant, I said, don't pay taxes. What I was really the point I'm trying to make is that the taxation is part of the specific repression of our people. I mean, it is not there for anything else other than to basically set up the conditions of genocide, of our genocide. That's what it's for. That's why it exists. That's what it's being basically the legerdemain it creates is used for. So,
but taxes are the price you pay for civilization.
Yeah, but the problem is whose civilization are we
paying?
Well,
I know that's one of these statements like, well, I understand the concept of a general fund, community fund, collective efforts and these things, and we can call that under the general term taxation. But yeah, it's a question of what type of taxation, who's taxing you for what, and how you're being taxed, and these things. It's like.
But it's like you said the other day. When one of the things we were talking about, you were saying that before the Great Society programs, the Catholics were organized in a way to basically do charity. And they could do it in a much more direct and culturally uplifting way than the government has ever shown capacity to do, right?
Yeah, they didn't encourage family breakup and illegitimacy. Right?
Yeah, for example, So this is just another example of the taxation, which was, the Great Society programs were actually, I've actually seen them used as why we should have an increase in taxes, right?
Yeah.
So that we can basically help with more wealth transfer to these poor people. And it just, all you can do is scratch your head and hope that you can wake people up to the idea that they are just in a brain numb condition. And the reality is something that they're just not seeing whatsoever. They're not seeing anything that is real. that the social programs of the Great Society, the last thing in the world you want to do if you really want to help these communities anyway is give these programs more money.
Yeah.
Right. Programs are designed to destroy. This is the first thing we have to do is look at what is the real purpose of the programs that the oligarchs are establishing. What was the real purpose of the Great Society programs? You know, if at this point, where with a complete collapse, you know, the demographics and the statistics are so catastrophic for any community that basically is, uses the Great Society programs and government largesse as its primary source. They're so catastrophic at this point that there should be, automatic rejection and of any more, like we're going to help you even further. We say, no, you've helped enough. But also the people, the kids in college, who are like being conditioned by cultural Marxists to like keep the pedal to the metal in terms of all of these government integration and feminist and, the government programs. At this point, there really should be there's enough destruction, I would think, that a normal person can be brought to a clear-minded position and just say, we got to go back and re-look at all of this stuff and how was it brought about? And then look at the role that tax played in that. Look at the role that that the government's use of taxation as the basis for the creation of the government, the U.S. Treasuries. The U.S. Treasuries are really the real purpose of the taxation system, because with a taxation base, with a legal ability to tax, the government can create the treasuries, right? The treasury bonds,
mm-hmm.
and now this enables the government basically to become a million times more powerful than it would be if it was just in real relationship to wealth. So we've got to help people understand that tax isn't the answer. It doesn't help anybody, and reducing tax is also not going to help anything. It's just the goal that has to be achieved is an awareness of the whole process by which we've been brought to a point where we don't have any control over wealth, and taxation is just one of the things that distracts us from, understanding our enslaved condition.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of, like, say, elections.
Yeah.
Because no one's no one from any of the two major parties are proposing policies that would begin to shake the foundations of this system, because they were part of it, and you can't until someone directly goes after something like the Federal Reserve, the idea of monetizing debt and what the currency represents, how it's a debt-based currency and these things. And most people don't want to, again, most people's eyes glaze over when they hear this stuff. They all they know is they have cash in their wallet, and they can go down to the corner market and buy, a bag of chips and some beer with it, and therefore it has value.
That's what they know. And so as long as we believe in it, it has value. But unfortunately, the real force of our wealth concept at this point is not in the hands of the people. It's 100% in the hands of the oligarchs. We get the crumbs and they get the weapons. Mm-hmm. So, we need to turn this around. It's like we've been saying, we need a information revolution. And taxation is a good, to me, it's a pretty good, false dialectic is what it is, but, in a real sense. But it's a good way to get people who are in the normal matrix to start realizing that there's something deeper, something more sinister, something more organized against them.
Well,
and
I like income tax because every now and then I get a refund.
Yeah. Well,
go out and buy a TV set with it or something.
Yeah, I mean, like I bought a self-driving car because I got a $10,000 rebate.
Yeah, and that's one how it distorts.
And there's an example
Yeah.
right there, And then, of course, do I really need a self-driving car? Well, actually not. I mean, if you have a self-driving car, you're more likely to be punished by the people who create the car to like not be permitted to drive if you have the wrong political ideas, right?
If you
So really don't want the government to know where you are. I mean, this is part of freedom and privacy.
yeah, what if you get caught, smirking at an American Indian? No.
Yeah, that's right. With my MAGA hat on.
An elder.
Yeah. Yeah,
But it's like the mortgage. I remember one time I listened to a financial advisor talk about the repeal of the federal income tax. Because we don't want to get rid of that because then you lose your mortgage interest deduction. It's like, not talk about not seeing the larger picture. But again, repealing the federal income tax, what I really mean by that is that would also require a massive cut in federal spending.
Yeah, right.
And a reordering of society. That would mean like maybe not having a globe girdling empire, huge military expenditure, which is mostly fraud and abuse, and Pentagon has $20 trillion missing dollars unaccounted for.
That's just what they were able to see. I'm telling you, I mean, if I could, I would be laughed at if people knew my real belief about like how much money that they actually spent. I think you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. I think there's probably that they just invent credit and give it to anytime they need it.
Well, it started back in World War One. There was like it sounds like small potatoes, but in World War One they did after World War One when Congress was doing its hearings on some of the chicanery. They found there was like $4 billion just went for nothing. And this was Bernard Baruch and his cronies and the Bushes, and no one was ever prosecuted. But that's just how it got started. So just compound that, $4 billion in 1918.
Look, I mean, if you go, I mean, I've done this with a couple of, and it's been clear as a bell to me that the billionaires are also fake. I mean, like people like Bezos and Gates are, it's obvious, but almost all the billionaires are in one way or another related into the tribe. You know what I mean? They have access to cheap credit.
Well, like, wasn't Cecil Rhodes a fake billionaire? Same with J.P. Morgan.
Of course.
Because I think when they died, J.P. Morgan was found only worth like $10 million, which is a lot of money, but not like what he represented. And Cecil Rhodes, I think, gave all his money to the Rothschilds.
He gave it all to the Rothschilds. Yeah, I mean, and of course, when you look at Morgan's backing, you see the Rothschild family everywhere. So they were. I mean, the Morgan Bank was just in my opinion, it was just a distraction so that people wouldn't see the specific Jewish control over the banking system. And I think that the Federal Reserve has that same situation. You get into, obviously, like the Rockefellers are certainly large owners of it, right? And there are other families that have, there's purportedly Gentile that have enormous wealth, like the Gettys.
Yeah.
But absent a DNA test, what do we really know? I mean, I think we know about as much in terms of the families that actually own the thing as we do about who gets the money. You just don't have a clue. And so for democracy to improve, we got to get DNA tests on all of the oligarchs, financial and political, and media, and see what the family relationships are. We've got to get control over the creation of credit. I mean, the first thing is there has to be a debt jubilee for the nation in terms of interest payment on the debt.
Yeah.
Because this is completely insane. I mean, we'll just create money to pay off all of our debt, and the money we're creating to pay off our debt with will have no interest on it. Mm-hmm. Look what we've done. This is terrific. We buy all of the debt creating, interest paying treasuries back with one fell swoop, and not a single penny of the debt we created has interest. We've just saved ourselves 100% of the interest payment on the debt. Look at that. Look at what we've done with this one little Ledger Main. This would actually not be Ledger Main. This would be real benefit to the public. And then all of that money, and you're talking, just going forward, you're talking like $100 trillion, would then be basically wealth that would not be taken from the people. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
People pay the taxes. So,
well, here's an example. Put it in stark terms. I remember a year or so ago when President Trump ordered that missile attack on Syria, and apparently it scorched the desert somewhere and blew up a plane or two or a building. And the missiles themselves cost like $12 million a piece or something, and it turns out for the price that one missile attack, one unconstitutional, unjustified missile attack cost, they could have fixed the water system in what was that water system that they had, the town lost their water?
Right.
What town was it?
I forget. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Who could have fixed the water system there?
Of course. I mean, just change the social circumstance for the better everywhere. Well, obviously, you know, so they just...
Well, they have their priorities.
Well, they have priorities, and they have no accountability because they have no... they don't need to do any real accounting. If there's real democracy, there's real accounting. That's critical.
Yeah, another thing is you're worrying about tax rates, the tax burden. Okay, fine, worry about that. Whatever you mean by tax burden. But when the oligarchs have a position to debase the currency and at the same time create the petrodollar, and you can shift global economics and have your policies carried out without a law being passed. A good example is the Trilateral Commission plan to deindustrialize the United States and industrialize China to exploit the cheap labor there. And that was carried out in the 70s and 80s and 90s without any debate in Congress, but because the banksters and oligarchs were able to manipulate, the macroeconomics of the situation, they got their policies implemented. That's what's being debated, because it's their ability to manipulate the money supply, which enables them to fundamentally change our society here, debase it, deindustrialize it, and build up an industrial base abroad to achieve their objective. But there's no debate because it's not public policy. But really it is, because because of decisions made in secret by the Federal Reserve, or Henry Kissinger meeting with Arab, the royal, the Saudis, and creating the petrodollar. People's lives are being, entire communities are being destroyed, lives are being altered. The world history is being changed, but there's no debate about it. But we do
exactly.
But we get a passionate debate about a 28% marginal tax rate versus a 50% marginal tax rate.
Or who gets cheap credit that they can use to buy corporations that make 3 or 4 times in profit what the tribe member is paying for the money.
Yeah.
I mean, just cheap credit in and of itself is the complete end of democracy. If you don't have any control over it, the people who have access to cheap credit, they can just buy anything they want at less than whatever the value is, the capitalization value, but the thing they're buying. Cheap credit just enables you to own everything.
It's the carry trade, not to mention the cumulative effects, the cumulative multi-general effects of usury, which has been legitimized or sort of internalized into the Western banking system for hundreds of years.
The tribe members get cheap credit, which they can buy everything, and of course the credit is debt. So they don't even have to pay any income tax on what they're using to buy the corporations with, the public is paying tax on everything that they earn with hard work, right?
Yeah.
And, so you can see that they don't pay tax. Romney, that whole class of individuals, there's no tax being paid there. But down here in the trenches where we live, everyone has to pay tax.
Joe, don't you believe in trickle down? They create jobs. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, like Mitt Romney, because the creative destruction. He goes, sometimes we lose a few jobs, and then, but we look at how many jobs we created with Staples. Yeah, you created like 1 million, jobs which are minimum wage, are below minimum, they're shown how to fill out the forms for SNAP cards with their employment.
Yeah, so they're low. So
we have to. The taxpayers picking up some of the.
So the low wages, and this is another scam. Yeah, the low wages are being subsidized with SNAP cards.
but this is the
which J.P. Morgan probably gets paid the minister.
Absolutely, and so this is the creative part of it, where they create wealth for themselves.
It is very creative in a way, right?
So creative. The creative part, the destruction side is like the middle class guys who had a small business that made stationery. Now it's all these giant Chinese companies, and the middle class mom and pop guys that had stationery stores. That the middle class
and the money stayed in that town. It didn't get
exactly. Yeah, it's right. And so it's the
local bank. These things. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the destruction side. So you've got the destruction of like the middle class and the creation of a slave state and enrichment of the oligarchs. And Romney had the bold face, balderdash to actually talk about that during the presidential campaign. And of course, the free market Republicans, no one ever called him on being, a slave of Satan, right? They just let him get away with it.
Yeah.
And so then there's no public debate. It's like, well, do you want to vote for the candidate that's going to lower taxes, make jobs, or for the higher taxes?
Yeah.
Just these stupid dialectic structures which are completely false and are just there to distract people from the fact that both sides are, basically working for the technological slave state and want to genocide you.
Well,
so
what we need is a 65% tax rate on the rich and a $15 minimum wage. That will solve the problems.
All the problems. Everything will just get better immediately, right? This is the problem. See, it's like arguing Hillary versus Trump. It's just which hand of Satan do you want to hold? It doesn't really matter. It's so you need to have what we need is the information revolution. Where people start to question the whole narrative, start doing their own research, and start refusing to just go along mentally. Right. That's the first. That's something we can do. It's like, we need to actually force a revolution. This will take some doing. But one thing we can do is not go along with it mentally, not put up with like, them creating a artificial structure that we lose on both sides of the deal. And we're pretending that there's some kind of choice or something. There's not.
Okay, Joe.
All right, brother. Well, it's good to, good to hear your voice. We'll get them next week. Okay.
Okay. Enjoy your weekend.
All right. You too, Tim. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.